Hello and welcome everyone. So this video is a lecture corresponding to chapter 11 in the OpenStax Principles of Microeconomics text. So we're covering monopoly and antitrust policy. This is following the third edition of that text. You can find the OpenStax text if you go to, let me kind of scroll back so you can find it. Go to openstax.org, under subjects, go to business, and then economics, and that's where you'll find microeconomics version of the text. There's also the macroeconomics version, and then economics has them combined. I always recommend when you click to get the book, download a PDF rather than just view online. I mean, viewing online is kind of a quick way to be able to read it, and it's nice and everything. The main issue I have with this is that though it's searchable and everything, there's no page numbers, so maybe it can make it difficult to refer back to. The PDF does have page numbers, but I don't know, kind of whatever works for you is what I recommend then. You can also get my free Substack version of my text, though I don't have anything specific to antitrust. I do talk about monopoly, natural monopoly, and so on and so forth. That's just microeconomicprinciples.substack.com. Right? And I've got some practice exams and everything, and other stuff that you might find useful. Okay, so let me just kind of move that aside, come back to the lecture. Right. So what we'll talk about here is going to be corporate mergers, regulating anti-competitive behavior, regulating natural monopolies, and then the great deregulation experiment. Our starting point is just the realization that it's not like directly illegal to be a monopoly. That's a common misconception. It is when you maybe act like a monopoly, so to speak, that you run afoul of antitrust regulators. All right, so the title here, oligopoly versus competitors in the marketplace. Large corporations such as natural gas producers can bring economies of scale to the marketplace. Will that benefit consumers, or is more competition better? It's really interesting. That's a really interesting thing to reflect on, because in some industries, if you have a single producer, especially if you have a natural monopoly, as we discussed, there's economies of scale. There's a situation where actually competition is worse for consumers. There's other industries where competition certainly makes things better for consumers, and that's an interesting. There's some interesting economics behind the reasons for each, and that's one of the reasons why mergers and then acquisitions, right? M&A in the field of law gets so much attention from, well, attorneys and then also economists trying to evaluate on a case-by-case basis what happens for a particular merger. By merger, what we mean is two formerly separate firms combined to make a single firm. And usually we're thinking about horizontal mergers where these are rivals that merge to become a single firm. There could also be a vertical merger, and that's a situation where maybe upstream or downstream of the production chain gets integrated into a single firm. So an example of that would be, well, if there's a producer of coal, like they've got mines and everything, and then if the same company that owns the mine also like buys out or like merges with the company that produces electricity, right? So then you have the input and you have the final good produced under one corporate structure. That would be a vertical merger. Acquisition, when one firm purchases another. Actually, maybe the way I described my example, maybe I told the story as like vertical acquisition, or whatever. So the point is, horizontal is when it's rivals, and vertical is when it's like separated out stages of the supply chain. Okay, so here's the number and sizes of mergers from 1999 and 2000, right? Number of mergers submitted for review by the Federal Trade Commission, 1999 to 2012, actually. 1999 and 2000 were relatively high compared to other years here. And then this is the size of the transaction. So anyway, the point here is that, well, look, there's a lot of mergers, and the money involved is substantial, which suggests the impact on consumers is also substantial. Antitrust laws are the laws that give the government power to block certain mergers, even in some cases break up large firms into smaller ones. Well, that's true. This is true of antitrust laws. This is a characteristic of antitrust laws. Generally speaking, I would also kind of broaden the definition to consider like it's basically the entire legal structure that seeks to limit or prevent anti-competitive behavior, really, is the idea. So historical antitrust laws, Sherman antitrust law, Clayton, and then I've never heard of this last one, honestly. I know the Sherman Act, I know the Clayton. For whatever reason, I'm actually completely ignorant of the last one that was there. But it is in the slide deck, so we'll talk about it. Right. So regulators have tried to measure the degree of monopoly power in an industry, right? measuring the degree of monopoly power the old way. Well, look, so this is a weird statement, but yeah, regulators are always interested in analyzing monopoly power, but or market concentration. This is especially important for looking at whether a merger is going to be beneficial for consumers or not. So one of the ways that they might be interested in doing this, well, also to see if there's violations of antitrust law, is one of the preconditions is often, is the firm a monopoly, or do they have is a sufficiently concentrated market? So there's ways to do that. You calculate this using maybe a 4 firms concentration ratio or something like that. Maybe you do this by looking at market share. So the reasons why regulators would try to measure the degree of monopoly power, or more properly, like the changes in monopoly power, would be to assess a merger or merger and acquisition to see if this is going to create a greater imbalance in the market or if it's going to actually better the situation for competition and consumers. So I mentioned the concentration ratio. It says an earlier tool which measures what share of the total sales in the industry are accounted for by the largest firms, typically the top 4 to 8 firms. Yeah, usually we're interested in the 4 firm concentration, but you might also care about the 8 firm. And actually, like from the perspective of economics, there's something interesting that you can learn from the comparison of actually the top 4 to the top 8 firm comparison, because it's a very different industry if you have 8 firms that have divided up a market versus an industry where you have a single firm that's huge and then 7 rivals that are approximately equal, or 4 and 4 or whatever. Anyway, so you can get a lot of information looking at comparing the concentration ratios. Market share is each firm's proportion of total sales in the market, right? For like benchmark, or for like a get a reference point, Microsoft's market share of the operating system market prior to their antitrust case in the late 1990s was around 95%, right? So that's pretty high market share, right? That's before the rise of, well, I mean, Apple existed, but it was before sort of the rise of Apple that was largely precipitated by actually a lot of college students buying iBooks and then MacBooks and so on and so forth, and then eventually iPhones as well, obviously, and the entire ecosystem involving the iPod. Without all that, Apple wouldn't have. There wouldn't have been much hope for changing the market concentration of the operating systems market. All right, Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, the HHI, is the approach to measuring market concentration by adding the square of the market share of each firm in the industry. Yep, you can actually find how this is calculated on the Justice Department's website. If you actually I don't want to do this right now and just interrupt the video, but you could find this on the Justice Department, on the U.S. Justice Department's website. Just go to your favorite search engine and type in HHI index and then antitrust or Justice Department, and one of the first few things that's going to come up will be a blurb that actually talks about how they exactly how they calculate it. So anyway, defining the market in current times. Defining market is often difficult and controversial because there's been 2 important shifts that affect how markets are defined, in particular technology and globalization. So markets, broadly speaking, is going to be abstractly thinking about bringing together buyers, sellers, demand and supply of a particular product at a particular point in time, though it could be geographically isolated or widespread, especially if mediated through technology and so on and so forth, right? So the idea is there's now greater access to markets actually through the internet for all firms, basically, which is interesting if you're reflecting on what's the smallest number of customers that you need for your business to be viable, right? It used to be a sort of specialty store, something that is very much a niche. You can think of a sewing shop or a ski shop or a running shoe store or something wouldn't have been able to, or a science store, models model trains or something like that wouldn't have been able to survive in a really small town even 20 years ago. But with e-commerce, there's actually some of these small some of these niche industries have stores that have a much larger online presence than than their physical storefront. And in fact, their entire existence is largely based on their ability to find consumers outside of their geographic area. Anyway, so the new approach to antitrust regulation involves giving detailed analysis of specific markets and companies instead of defining market and counting up total sales. It's done by estimate the demand curve, estimate the supply curve that the firms posing a merger face. Then try to build a statistical model that estimates the likely outcome for consumers if the two firms are allowed to merge. Well, right. So, I mean, what we're interested in doing is what's going to be the change in demand, and then what's going to be the change in supply. How our costs are going to change? Are there economies of scale or something like that? Yes, as I said, under U.S. antitrust laws, monopoly itself is not illegal, but U.S. antitrust laws rule against some restrictive practices. The way that I always say is that it's not illegal to be a monopoly, but it might be illegal to act like a monopoly, right? Or at least if you act like a stereotypical monopoly, you're likely to grab the attention of antitrust regulators. Restrictive practices are those that do not involve outright agreements to raise prices. That'd be price fixing. That'd be like directly illegal. Or to reduce the quantity produced. That's like tantamount to price fixing, also directly illegal, but that might have the effect of reducing competition, right? So the idea is like, if there's price fixing or something that's equivalent to price fixing, that is just directly illegal, right? Per se illegal. If you have something that is not price fixing, not reducing the quantity, not allocating markets or something like that, right? Then the regulators will use what's called like a rule of reason approach. So they're interested in, does this practice have the effect of reducing competition, and what was the goal? Was there a compelling business reason? And so, depending on exactly how they'll evaluate it, they might view very differently the circumstance where the goal from the outset is just quite obviously anti-competitive versus if the goal is you're facing this really weird cost structure that has this second order effect of being anti-competitive. And so the primary goal wasn't like trying to outcompete rivals so much as just like attending to the cost structure you face. Types of restrictive practices. So you could have a minimum resale price maintenance agreement. So this requires dealers who buy from a manufacturer to sell for at least a certain minimum price. One of the reasons why they might do this is to protect, so you have wholesale pricing and you have like big box warehouse retailers, but then you have like small independent shops. A good example of that would be like a camera shop. Years ago, I mean, now everybody has like a digital camera on their phone, so it's not the same thing. But 20 years ago, there'd be specialty camera stores, so if you're going to be a photographer, like wedding photography or whatever for videographer and so on and so forth, you might go to one of these camera stores and you'd have somebody who is an expert and could tell you all the features of all these different models. And the worry would be, well, if the wholesale big box retailer selling online presumably is able to sell at a lower price, they might free ride on the information of the expert that you've gotten. So the worry would be people might go to this expert and then learn all they want about which is the model they want to buy and then go and buy it online later. So for a variety of other reasons, like that's really bad for the larger company. There was a interesting case law about the golf club manufacturer Ping, where they I think it went to the Supreme Court, and I think they found actually in favor of Ping, who was arguing that they wanted to maintain a particular price because they viewed being fitted for golf clubs by a golf pro and getting the exact version of the golf clubs that are like right for you was really important to success of the product and to your experience with the product, and it couldn't be separated. It was wrong to separate that by having like a big box seller just sell you the golf clubs without fitting and trying them out and everything. So anyway, if you're interested, there's like a whole case behind that. Exclusive dealing. So this is an agreement that a dealer will sell products only from one manufacturer. This was one of the allegations alleged against Microsoft, where with the antitrust case in the late 1990s, where the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers that were building the hardware, were required to actually buy a certain number of licenses of Microsoft Windows, and then they could only put Microsoft Windows on their machines that they were making, and or they had to buy so many that they didn't have they would run out of the manufacturers would run out of hardware before they would run out of copies of licenses for copies of Microsoft Office. It would have been Windows 95 to put on it, actually. So there's an interesting case there. Tying sales, a situation where a customer is allowed to buy one product only if the customer buys another product. The actual Microsoft case that I'm talking about had to deal with antitrust proceedings with Microsoft allegedly trying to leverage Windows 95 to gain market share in the browser market for their Internet Explorer to the detriment of Netscape Navigator. Bundling, situation where multiple products are sold as one. So the important distinction between tying and bundling. So in some sense, tying is like the illegal form of bundling. Bundling is the idea, ideally you have consumers with negatively correlated willingness to pay. You have one consumer that likes one product, one consumer that likes the other product, and then you sell it at a price that gets both of them to buy. Like basically the lowest sums of the willingness to pay would be the price of the bundle that would get both people to buy. Anyway, so the idea with bundling is that, well, you're selling lots of products for a single price. The idea with tying is that you're allowed to buy one product only if you also buy the other product. And so the better distinction between them is that the idea with tying is that it's illegal if it's likely to be illegal if you have market power in one of those markets and maybe not in the other. And so that was what they were alleging against Microsoft, is that they were leveraging their 95% market share in the operating system market to gain ground in the browser market, which they face much more competition. Okay, so regulating natural monopolies. Most true monopolies today in the US are regulated natural monopolies. That's right. Yeah. So we said monopolies are really rare. And if you want to find an actual monopoly, you're probably looking at the utilities. And those are generally speaking natural monopolies, and they're generally speaking regulated. Natural monopoly arises when average costs are declining over the range of production that satisfies market demand. Yeah. Typically happens when fixed costs are large relative to variable cost. We kind of need all these together. The way that I define natural monopolies is a situation where there's just this huge fixed cost, like infrastructure cost associated with getting started and operating in the first place. And then you have a low to zero marginal cost of serving another customer. So the idea is like with utilities, you build a power plant that's really expensive, but then the marginal cost of serving one more like outlet is almost nothing. That's why, nobody guards the outlets. And, if you go to like Target or Walmart, go to the public bathrooms, there's outlets in the bathroom, or at the airport there's like outlets, or on campus there's outlets, and like you don't have to pay or like scan your card every time you want to plug something in if you have to charge your phone real quick, right? And the reason why is because effectively the marginal cost of serving one more customer is zero. There's a large fixed cost, and then that affects the pricing that's then charged for the entity that's actually paying for the electricity. Anyway, that's natural monopoly. And the further thing that happens with natural monopoly is you don't want competition, because competition leads to inefficient duplication. You don't need like two power plants. You need one maybe, or like two sets of water pipes throughout a municipality. You need one. And then the other problem besides inefficient duplication is if there's multiple competitors operating, they siphon off the large volume of demand necessary to recoup the huge fixed cost of operating in the first place. Okay, regulatory choices in dealing with natural monopoly. Natural monopoly will maximize profits, producing at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, like all firms, right? Find where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. That'll give us our quantity. This will be our associated monopoly price, right? Okay, so by looking to the market demand curve to see what price. Monopoly will produce at point A with a quantity of 4 and a price of 9.3, like we said. Okay. Actually, I didn't say the price until just now. If antitrust regulators split this company exactly in half, each half would produce at point B with average cost of 9.75 and output of 2. This would be a bad idea. Why would, I don't know. Okay, fine. So if they did split this company in exactly half, each half would produce at point B. That's optimistic, but okay, fine. If we could do this, they'd, rather than producing 4, they'll each produce 2. Okay. And now the price is going to be at, let's see, 9.5. Okay. Because that's at, that's where average cost is there. Yeah. Average cost of 9.75. Regulators might require the firm to produce at a point where marginal cost equals demand at point C. They might require them to produce where marginal cost equals demand at point C out here. Wait, marginal cost equals demand at point C out here. Yeah, okay, this is point C. Yeah, okay. However, if the firm is required to produce a quantity of 8 and sell a price of 3.5, the firm's going to incur losses. Well, yeah, because this is going to be a price that is below average cost, right? So we're going to have a loss right there. The most likely choice is point F, where the firm is required to produce a quantity of 6 and charge a price of 6.5. Let's see, quantity of 6, price of 6.5. Yeah, sure. Okay, because now you've got a situation where average cost and demand are the same, so this would be 0 economic profit. Okay. Cost plus regulation is where regulators permit a regulated firm to cover its costs and make a normal level of profit. Right? So the only way that you can raise your price to make more profit, well, you can't really make more profit, but the way that you could raise your price is if you raise your costs also. So there's an interesting business school case study where there was a company who was a coal-fired power plant, and they were limited on the price that they could charge per kilowatt hour, for electricity, by the price of coal, by how much they were paying for coal, because that affected their costs, and this is like cost plus regulation. So the only way they could raise their kilowatt hour charge is if their costs rose. So they made that happen by buying their coal mine supplier. And then they raised the price of coal so that they could raise the price of electricity. And then there's price cap regulation. That's when regulator sets a price that a firm cannot exceed over the next few years. Yeah, so you set a price cap. It's like a price ceiling, right? Regulator sets a price that can't exceed over the next few years. Of the two, I would suspect that this one's going to lead to way more inefficiency because it's going to be way less responsive to changing market conditions, especially like changing costs, right? So if you set a price cap, a price ceiling, and then all of a sudden your costs rise a lot, but you can't raise prices, that's a really big problem. Whereas with cost plus regulation, if your costs rise, you can raise your prices. And so of the two, I think the cost plus is probably more efficient. Deregulation, removing government controls over prices and quantities. Right. Deregulation is basically privatizing industries. Regulatory capture, so that could be part of the story, part of what happened in the story behind the coal plant and the electricity plant. But anyway, regulatory capture is when the supposedly regulated firms end up playing a larger role in setting the regulations that they'll follow. And as a result, they capture the people usually through the promise of a job that they capture okay. I don't know if I like how that's written, but the problem with regulatory capture is this revolving door between industry and government. That's the problem. So then the argument for it is you'd say something like, well, look, the regulators have to know something about the industry, so former industry officials are the only ones who know what reasonable regulations to enact, right? So like if you want to do cost plus regulation and you want to think of like what's going to be a normal profit, or if you want to do a price cap, it's going to be really challenging even for economists to go in and try to say exactly what the price limit should be or whatever, or what the cost plus pricing premium should look like. And so maybe they make an argument that, well, people who are previously working in the industry would be the best qualified to set those regulations. The problem is when regulators go back and forth between industry and government, then they end up maybe being subject to the temptations of enriching themselves and the industry at the expense of the public. Okay, so Sarbanes-Oxley Act, designed to increase confidence in financial information provided by public corporations to protect investors from accounting fraud. Right, so And then Dodd-Frank, so to promote financial stability of the United States by improving accountability and transparency in the financial system, to end too big to fail, and protect the American taxpayer by ending bailouts, protect consumers from abusive financial practices. These both sound good on paper. There are unintended consequences of both. Airline deregulation. So 1926, the first U.S. government regulation of the first U.S. government regulation of airline industry, giving airlines permission to fly certain routes based on mail delivery needs. 1934, antitrust authorities charged the Postmaster General with colluding with major airlines to monopolize nation's airways. 1938, this is already like the 30s. 1938, the U.S. government created Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, to regulate airfares and routes instead. I mean, they definitely took a page out of the railroad industry's playbook, which had been maybe the more interesting earlier antitrust cases. 1978, Airline Deregulation Act took the government out of the business of determining airfares and schedules. The following 30 years, greater competition from deregulation reduced airfares, increased efficiency, offered more service, increased jobs. So it's had kind of this major impact on the industry as a whole. Discussion question. Since deregulation, how has a string of mergers raised concerns over how competition might be compromised? Has it affected the consumer product and demand for it? Well, look, so the regulators have been really careful about which mergers get approved and which get denied. There's been a lot of mergers proposed amongst airlines. Not all of them had been approved. There's also like bankruptcies and like consolidation. There are many airlines that were around 20 years ago that have either merged or are mostly merged and are no longer in existence. My favorite airline, Midwest Express, no longer exists. It was my favorite airline because they would give you chocolate chip cookies on the flight, right? Like real chocolate chip cookies. And they merged with somebody. They don't exist anymore. But the idea is like since all these more recent mergers, the airline industry has been more profitable, and basically since maybe the Great Recession or financial crisis, with famously like American Airlines and actually all the airlines being in the red except for Southwest. And then more recently, it's like Southwest that has the financial problem. Well, the issue is because these mergers ended up making all those other companies strong against Southwest. So anyway, it's a really interesting industry to study. And so, sure, yeah, you can kind of think about the discussion reflection question on your own as well. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll go ahead and conclude here. I'll see you in the next one.